pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Now, as a matter of housekeeping before we get started, this was advertised as a public meeting for Little Lake Harbor, Pinelands, and Bass River, and I just need to first make sure that we do not have a quorum of these boards present. So, Tyler, do you mind starting with roll call from your Board of Education?
Ms. Stover? Ms. D'Ambrosio? Mr. Halford? Mr. McMahon? Ms. Farrow?
All right, for the Little Lake Harbor Board of Education, it's a roll call. Ms. Chanutzi? Mr. Keeb? Ms. Palin? Ms. Roth? Ms. Semler? Dr. Snyder? And Mr. Zimmerman. All right, for the Bass River Board of Education, Ms. Adams? Ms. Bitzberger? Mr. Fodor? Ms. Heinrichs? Mr. Schmidt? And finally, for the Pinelands Board of Education, Mr. Bartlett? Mr. Bonneke? Mr. Dalio? Ms. Fagan? Ms. Hanadel? Mr. Rossetti? Ms. Paklakua? Mrs. McVeigh? Ms. Martin? Okay. I don't know your board members' names, I'm sorry. Okay, and since we do have a quorum of some of the boards of education, this is to advise those present at this meeting of the Board of Education of Pinelands Regional, Little Lake Harbor, Bass River, Tuckerton, and Eagleswood that adequate notice of this meeting was provided in accordance with the Open Public Meeting Act. This notice has been posted in the Board of Education office in the school buildings. This notice was also mailed to the Press of Atlantic City and filed with the municipal clerks of Bass River, Eagleswood, Little Lake, and Tuckerton. I'm going to ask for this next part, all members who are present to either yay or nay. The next item up is a motion to approve tonight's agenda. Can I have a motion to approve the agenda as presented? All right, all in favor of approving tonight's agenda as presented, please say aye. Opposed, please say nay. Any abstentions? Okay, guys, as we know, we're here tonight to hear about the feasibility study. Joining us is the team from Porzio, Bromberg, Newman. That's Dr. Grip, Mr. Steve Sia, Ms. Kerry Wright, Mr. Vito Gagliari, and joining us by Zoom is Commissioner David Hespy. Welcome, Dr. Hespy. So they're gonna go through the study, and at the end, the public comment is gonna be your opportunity to ask questions. These mics at the end of the aisle, just please form a single file line, and the group will take questions at the conclusion of their presentation. Floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nick. Can everyone hear me? There we go. Hi. Hi, everyone. My name is Carrie Wright. I'm a partner at Porzio, Bromberg, and Newman. We're going to go through an introduction with everybody a little bit more detailed, but I want to thank Nick Brown for that kind introduction. And I want to thank the boards of education who all jointly got together and worked on this very important process for all of your communities. We know how important this is. We took it very seriously, and we are thankful and grateful for the opportunity to work with you all since we know how important this issue is for you. So as I said, my name is Carrie Wright. This is my partner, Vito Gagliardi. Together we chair the education and employment team at Porzio, Bromberg, and Newman, where we have a subspecialty in school district reconfiguration. We have the pleasure also of working with the experts who actually wrote the feasibility study. We help them with it, We talk about the analysis, we talk about the legal issues that surround the feasibility study. The feasibility study is written by experts in their individual fields. So next to me to my right is Dr. Richard Grip. Dr. Grip is the foremost authority in school demography. He is the school demographer for the New York Public Schools, and he has done well over 100 demographic studies across the state of New Jersey for many school districts. He's responsible for the racial analysis and the demographic analysis that we'll go through in a few minutes. To his right is Steve Sia. Steve is our financial expert. Steve is a former business administrator, just finished a stint as an interim BA in Paramus. He's also worked for the Hohokus schools and several other districts as a school business administrator. With me also to my right, Dave Hespy, coming to you live from video because he's recovering from a surgery from a few weeks ago. So he wasn't able to be here in person, although he would love to be here. But Dave Hespy is a two-time former Commissioner of Education for the state of New Jersey. He was responsible for completing the educational analysis that you'll hear about tonight. So we're going to go over the feasibility study, each of the sections in the feasibility study, and the conclusions. Hopefully we'll be able to anticipate all of the questions you have, but as Nick said, when we're done going over the background, how we completed the study, and what the conclusions are, we are very interested in hearing your questions. I'm going to turn it over for a minute to my partner Vito Gagliardi to make a few comments as well.
Thanks, Gary. And thank you for the opportunity to work on something of such monumental significance to your communities, and certainly for the volunteers who sit on a Board of Education and the time that you put in, the opportunity to make a difference. Well, what we're talking about has the opportunity to transform the educational programs that are delivered to the students in your communities in a way that would benefit the taxpayers. But I say that because that's the conclusion the experts reached, as opposed to a conclusion someone told us to reach and then write 150 pages to justify it. So we have done more of these, I think, than anyone in the state. And there are times when our recommendation, candidly, is not to go forward with what you initially thought might be a good idea. So the recommendations you're getting here are the bona fide views of the foremost experts who exist. And then there's a two-step process after we do this. So while folks were looking forward to the release of this study, this is not the end of the process. It's the end of the analysis, but it's the beginning of this two-step process. The first part of the process is for the elected officials in each community to decide if they want to move forward with what's recommended here as far as a regionalization is concerned. The savings are considerable, but there are reasons that the people in your community might decide this is or is not attractive. The second part of that is if the local boards of education decide that they think the districts should be regionalized in whole or in part. That is, some of them may stay the way they are now, and some may choose to regionalize, but whatever change you're looking to advance has to be submitted to the voters for consideration. So this is democracy in its purest form, right? The elected officials will decide what they think is in their community's best interest, and then the people who live in the community, who trust you with their children and their tax dollars, will decide if that's a configuration that they want to move to or if they want to maintain the status quo. So we are happy to be here. We're happy to answer your questions. Obviously, all the questions that come up tonight are not all the questions that will exist. So we will obviously be available to serve as a resource, but I want to make clear that the experts wrote the study, the lawyers provided legal advice, the educators and the elected officials in the communities will decide what they want to pursue, and the voters will make the ultimate decisions. So we'll go through each one of the experts' sections, and then we'll articulate the recommended conclusion, and then be happy to answer questions, I suspect first from the elected officials and then from the public at large, however you choose to do it. But again, thank you for trusting us with something so important, and thank you for your kind attention this evening. So the first expert who will summarize his work is Dr. Richard Grip, because you need the demographics and an analysis of how many children you have in the community and how many students you're likely to have going forward before we look at the educational and financial impacts of any reconfiguration. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. I'm going to actually move to the front if I don't scare anybody without a mask. So this evening, I am going to talk for maybe about 10 minutes regarding my section, and then I'll pass it back, and probably Dave Hespy will go next after me. So let's get right to it. So when we were hired to do this, we were hired to look at 4 different scenarios with respect to the status quo in terms of an organizational structure for the school district. So this is what we want to talk about first, just so we're going to talk about it all night long. The first one is forming a full PK-12 regional between the 4 communities. The second one is forming a PK-12 regional between Bass River, Eagleswood, and Little Egg Harbor, where Tuckerton would remain a PK-6 district, and then they would send their 7 to 12 students to the new regional district for middle and high school. The next scenario is going to look almost the same, except we're going to switch out Tuckerton with Eagleswood. So you have Bass River, Tuckerton, and Little Egg Harbor forming a PK-12 regional, whereas Eagleswood remains a PK-6 and sends its students to the new regional for grades 7 to 12. And the last one, we have a formation of PK-12 regional just between Bass River and Little Egg Harbor, where Eagleswood and Tuckerton both remain K-6 districts and send their students to the new regional 7 to 12. As a parent, and I'm going to just talk about this because I'm sure we have parents in the room besides board members. I want to say that in any of these particular scenarios that we're going to cover tonight, all the students are going to be educated in exactly the same schools and places that they are currently being educated. This is just an organizational structure that's going to be changing. The kids will be educated in the same schools. I think that's pretty important to understand. So my job as a demographer, most people don't even really want to hear anything of what I have to say. They really want to hear the guy behind me who talks all about the finances and what the tax impact is going to be. But I'll talk for a few moments tonight, at least about what I studied, so that you have an idea. A lot of this is driven not by me, but by the State Department of Education. We submit these reports. We've done so many of these, so we know what statutes, what type of things need to be in the study. So if you see things that I'm covering that may just seem like, why did he bother to look at that? That's kind of why. A lot of this is statute driven. So just a very quick synopsis about myself. I have a doctorate from Rutgers in EdStat and measurement. I'm also called a psychometrician, which are really people who work for the College Board and looking at the reliability and validity of testing. But that's not the area I went into. I went into demography. Been doing this for the last 23 years, publishing in journals still around the country, making presentations, testified as an expert witness in school demography. So that's just a little bit about my background. So the first things that we look at are the population trends of each of the 4 communities. So we look at the macro first. And when I look at the population trends, we're looking at the census, which just came out for 2020, as you're probably aware. We also look at what the population projections are going to be, and that's by usually a third-party agency. That's the first thing. Then we look at, from the census, different demographic characteristics of each community. What kinds of characteristics? Well, race, racial makeup. What's the socioeconomic status of each community? So here you're just seeing a quick breakdown. It's almost very similar in terms of race. We do, like I said, a lot of these studies, and very often there's one community that is different as with respect to the other 3 or 4 that we're looking at. That's not the case here. All 4 communities are very similar in makeup by race, by income, home value prices, and education, all very similar. The next thing I looked at, now we're moving away from the towns. Now we're going down more to the micro, which would be the school district level. And I looked at the historical enrollments from the last 6 years, from the 14-15 year to the 19-20 year. And you may say, well, why not 2021, which was last year? Due to the pandemic, which had a lot of impact on enrollments around the state, we did not want that the impact of the pandemic to influence our analysis. So that's why we stopped in the 1920 year. But up here, what it just shows you are the general patterns of each of the 4 school districts in the last 6 years in terms of the enrollment. For the most part, you can see, at Bass River, obviously not having their own school anymore, they were declining, only 93 students in the 1920 year. Eagleswood has been declining recently, Little Egg Harbor, fairly stable, as well as Tuckerton, and Pinelands has been also dropping. Next, how do we figure out how many students are going to be here in the future? Well, there's something we use called the cohort survivor ratio method, which actually looks at the migration patterns of students historically, and that we use to project our future enrollments. But for the younger kids, for kindergarten kids, we use birth counts. And I got Department of Health data for the last 12 years for each of the 4 communities. As you're quite aware, Little Egg Harbor is the largest of the 4 communities with almost 22,000 people, so they would have the most births, which is obvious. I also contacted the Planning and Zoning Department in each community to find out if there's any new residential housing coming online that could impact our projections. So what do? If there's a significant amount of housing, we sometimes bump up our projections if we expect a lot of homes to come online. But you can see there, Bass River, there was none because they're in the Pinelands, and that's a protected area. But the other 3 areas are under 30 homes are projected in the recent next couple years. Next, I projected enrollments for a 10-year period. From the 2021 year through 29-30, if we combined all of the districts in the first scenario, we talked about this K-12 big regional. The enrollment of all those districts would be about 3,700 students in the 1920 year, right now, well, a year and a half ago. In the 29-30 year, we would expect that number to drop down to under 3,500 students, which would be a loss of, say, 190 students from where we are now. So that would kind of continue this declining trend that we have seen in some of the districts in the regional. The next thing I look at are, can the existing buildings accommodate all the students? Well, the answer to this one is easy. It's yes. You're accommodating them right now. So it's a simple yes. No one's moving around, like I said earlier tonight. The districts either have a small surplus of seating currently or have a small number of what we call unhoused students. It's a fancy word that they use down at the Department of Ed. It really means inadequate seating. But to make a long story short, there's really not a need to do any expansions for any of the buildings. The current structures are fine because you're not expecting a lot of new students in the future. In fact, you're having a projected decline in some of the totals, as you can see. So the bottom line there, it says, as enrollments are not projected to change significantly, the capacity is projected to be adequate in each district. So again, that's another check mark in my thing that I have to look at with respect to statutes to make sure that everybody can be accommodated. The answer is yes. One other thing we looked at was the economically disadvantaged student population in each community over the last 5 years. And what we found out was that the Little Egg Harbor district has the highest percentage of students with free and reduced lunch. Almost 1 out of every 2 students is receiving free and reduced lunch. 29% was the lowest, and that's in Eagleswood. The last thing I looked at was something called racial impact. Vito had mentioned one of the things we have to look at by statute is to make sure there's no negative racial impact upon any kind of a reorganization that we do. However, again, I'm going to come back to that again. Since no students are moving, everyone is staying in the same building, you're not moving kids across into different schools, there is not going to be any negative racial impact. So I looked at, just by statute, I looked at all the racial percentages for the last 6 years in each one of the school districts. Okay? What I did find is that the racial distribution is almost identical across the board. And that kind of makes sense, because if you listen to me at the top of the hour, I talked about that there's about a 90 to 95% white population in the aggregate in terms of everybody, older people, younger people, everybody. And the school level, sometimes it doesn't always mirror what we see in the community if people are moving in of different races that are younger. But in this case, they were fairly similar to what the population is in each community. Okay, that ends my piece for tonight, and I'm going to move over to Mr. Dr. Hespy. You over there?
I am. Can everyone hear me? Was that a yes?
Yes, sir.
Okay, great. Yeah, I'm at the disadvantage that you can see me and hear me, but I can't see you, but I can hear you. So I think that's the good news. So I'm sandwiched between two very complicated chapters of the study, the demographic study and the finance study. The education chapter really can be summed up in one question, and that, how is this good for kids? And that's what my chapter seeks to answer. And in doing that, I conducted multiple site visits. I did interviews. We did analysis of assessment data and school performance data, looked through your websites and the public information available about your districts, and came to some conclusions based upon all of that, and then distilled it into around a 40-page chapter. Are we doing a PowerPoint there, by the way, or not?
Yes, Dave. So I have your slide up right now with your credentials, so that's where we're starting. Okay. So you can tell me to advance.
Right, if we could, hopefully everyone has had a chance to see my bona fides there, and we'll go to the next slide, the first slide thereafter, Rich. So let me begin by just thanking all the administrators and the staff of the various districts for, what I thought was very generous and gracious use of their time, especially during a very trying period last spring, of course, during the throes of COVID. And I think one of the things that made me very grateful to them is almost all of them are wearing multiple hats and trying to live that value of shared services. And I knew it was a very difficult time for them, and they were very gracious. So I just wanted to thank them right from the start. Now, here's the first slide, and I'm looking at the question of, well, how are our schools doing now? How are our districts doing now? That status quo option that Rich discussed. And the bottom line is the schools are doing fine. They're implementing the mandated curriculum standards. They have aligned programs and instruction in place. They're making the right investments in professional development and innovation. We see enrichment and co-curricular and technology investments. But the question really comes down to, as we look outside of Ocean County and we look regionally, if anything, the pandemic has taught us that we really do live in a global marketplace, economy, workforce. How do they stack up when we look beyond the small pond and into that bigger pond? And when you do that, you see the value of regionalization and gathering expertise. And I'll discuss all of that in a second. Ultimately, I believe the answer to the question of will students be well served through regionalization is yes, they will. And you can think about it this way, and that is you've done a lot across all of the districts in terms of shared services, but there's a limit to what you can accomplish without regionalization. And regionalization allows you to put in place those last pieces that you just can't get to through shared services. And those last few pieces are very important to being able to put together a curriculum and programs and services and professional development, serve better your special education students, students struggling academically because of their family circumstances, or limited English proficiency. And those are the things that I want to focus on in the next couple of slides. So, Rich, the next slide should be two paragraphs. Students in all the schools will have the opportunity. Do you have that slide up?
I'm there.
Excellent, excellent. So we believe that as we put in those last pieces of shared services, that we'll see an opportunity for every school to be able to improve their educational quality. How is that going to be done? Well, there's a very accepted best practices. The most successful schools in the country share certain best practices, and I'll lay them out in detail in the report. But I believe, and the research supports, that a regionalized model is going to best be able to put in place those best practices. Next slide, Rich.
Okay.
So bringing together, for example, into a shared curriculum development office, that expertise and subject matter and grade level expertise can allow you to unify the curriculum vertically, horizontally, and get deeper into some of the skill sets. And as I indicated earlier, the review of the assessment data does demonstrate that every one of the schools has opportunities to improve, certainly in terms of the region. But if you look at the state average, for example, every school has opportunities to improve. And I think that improvement can come through a beefed up curriculum office that could be developed through a regionalized setting. A regional human capital and professional development office could also support that. You know, good teachers are sometimes hard to find, especially in those difficult subject areas. And a regional human capital office could help you do that. Could also put in place professional development that is based on your own data analytics. And I'm not saying that these things don't exist, but I think they can be vastly improved through a regional office. Increased enrichment opportunities, extracurricular activities, clubs, round out some of those opportunities. Next slide, Rich.
Okay.
Also, in terms of serving your special student population. So when I say that, I mean students who are struggling academically and could use supports and interventions. Students with IEPs especially. Limited English students, which is a growing population. As Rich indicated, your socioeconomically disadvantaged student populations can be better served. Each one of the districts also has been targeted for chronic absenteeism issues, and those as well. Those initiatives, I think, especially can be very much more addressed through a regional expertise guidance and connecting with partners in your county, for example, given that so much of chronic absenteeism results through some family issues. Next slide, Rich.
Okay.
So we have, in this review, we have not identified any educational obstacles to regionalization. Ultimately, our recommendation is that these advantages, improvements, all be put in place over a period of time. We believe that during at least the initial 5-year period, all staff, all students should remain where they are until the new school board has been able to do the due diligence necessary to fully understand each community's needs, each community's progress, and then jointly work through what the next 5 years thereafter look like. So I'll end at this point, and I know we'll come back with questions. So thank you, Rich.
Thank you, Dave.
All right, my turn. So this is the financial analysis. My name's Steve Sia. Carrie went through some of my background. The one thing I did want to point out is 21 of my 25 years as a business administrator were with West Milford and Paramus. And they happen to be very closely aligned with the proposed all-purpose regional district that we looked at. They have just about the same number of kids, around 3,800. So I bring that kind of experience and thought behind and insights into the analysis. So let's start with the framework for building the model and some of the documents used. So as you can see from the slide, we used 2 years of revenues and expenses directly from the audit. So we used actual expense and revenue numbers. 3 years of budget, and then the projections that Dr. Grip had mentioned, those were used and then included as part of the modeling. And we used these to develop a 10-year projection on both the revenue and the expense side. So the model also builds upon some key assumptions. So these aren't an exhaustive list of the assumptions, those are in the report, but I wanted to highlight some of the more critical ones for you tonight. So the tax levy and the rates are estimates. They're for comparative purposes, to compare the status quo with the various options that Dr. Grip identified at the beginning of the presentation. So I like to say that they're projections, they're not predictions. Many things can happen in the course of developing the regional that you may that the new board may choose to do that might have some impact on what the final numbers will be. The estimates are expressed in 2020 dollars. So we're not considering inflation. We're not considering the time value of money. State aid for each of the scenarios approximates the aid that was in the 2019-2020 budget. The educational programs are equivalent to that same year, that 2019-20 budget. So that's important on the, as we talk about the tuitions, because we need to ensure that the student-teacher ratio is consistent, because we want to consider apples to apples and not different educational programs. We want to see the regional compared to the status quo without other things impacting that analysis. So we also provided a projection of the equalized value over 10 years. We used a regression analysis for that purpose. The tuitions are based on the state certified tuition rates with some modifications, which we'll go into in a little bit. The full implementation in year 1. And we do that because that better illustrates the full financial impact over the 5 and the 10-year period. So we don't consider a phase-in, although phase-in is likely to happen as you implement a new organizational structure of this type. As Dr. Grip had mentioned, all the schools remain the same, and the collective bargaining agreements will remain in force until the new regional negotiates new agreements. So before we get into the actual results, I want to frame the results before we get to those and give you a little context. The first piece has to do with the referendum that Mr. Gagliardi had mentioned earlier. So this decision will go to the voters. And to help facilitate that decision, we want to make sure that we select an allocation method that's going to provide some tax savings for all the districts concerned. So current law indicates that there are two variables that can be used in order to determine what the tax allocation will be for a new regional. Those are equalized property value and enrollment, or some combination of the two. So when we ran through the analysis, we did so with a variety of percentages of both these variables. We used 100% equalized valuation, a 50-50 split between equalized valuation and enrollment, and 100% enrollment. We looked at all the variations in between to come up with our recommendation, and in all cases, that's going to be equalized value, 100% equalized valuation. We'll show the tables in a moment. The next slide are going to be tables, but when you're looking at the table, I just want to give you some of the conventions that are used on the table. So the dollar values are in thousands of dollars. The tax rates are in per $100 of equalized property value. Increases in tax levy are negative numbers, and reductions in tax levy or decreases are positive numbers. So taxes increase, negative. Taxes decrease, positive. So let's go and take a look at the first scenario, which is all the communities participating in the all-purpose regional using a 100% equalized valuation as the allocation method. So the best way, I think, for me to take you through this is to focus on one district. So let's focus on Little Egg Harbor. So going from left to right, you could see that under the status quo scenario, Little Egg Harbor's contribution to the new regional would be $30.5 million. So these numbers are in thousands, so that $30,539, you add 3 zeros onto that, it's $30.5 million. Under the unified district, the all-purpose regional, they would see the tax levy decrease to just over 30 million, or a decrease of $453,000. So let's look at some of the other districts. Eagleswood would see a tax reduction of a little more than 1.2 million. Tuckerton would see a tax reduction of 106,000, and Bass River would see a tax reduction of 585,000. That's under the 100% equalized value allocation. So let's take a look at the 50-50 split. So you could see from this that the numbers have changed a bit. Eagleswood sees more of a tax reduction at 1.3 million, almost 1.4 million. On the other hand, Little Egg Harbor sees their tax reduction go down to 315,000. Tuckerton sees actually an increase in taxes. That's why that number is negative, an increase of 70,000. And Bass River sees their tax decrease increase to 750,000. So that's some of the movement that's made when we change the allocation method. Let's take a look at 100% enrollment. So in the all-purpose regional, with all communities being involved under 100% enrollment allocation, we see the same trend continue as we did with the 50-50 split. So Eagleswood, again, has further reductions in tax levy up to 1.5 million. Little Egg Harbors still seeing a tax decrease, but it's down to 177,000. Tuckerton sees continued tax increases of 246,000, and Bass River sees a tax reduction of 914. What's that? I'm sorry, annual, okay. So it's important to realize that these numbers are annual numbers, 5-year averaged. So you can see it as both 5 and 10-year projections for the numbers, but these are annual numbers taking a 5-year block and then averaging those together. So it smooths out any differences from any one year to another, but they're annual savings or increases and annual tax levy. Thanks for that clarification. So we see a lot of savings. Where did that come from? So I'd like to talk a little bit before we get into the other scenarios, some of the savings, the methodologies that were used, and then we could go from there. So the methodologies were threefold. The first is using comparisons of like districts, taking districts with the same or similar enrollment size, seeing what they spend in different cost centers, and then comparing that to what the new regional or the individual districts within that regional would be spending. And I'd like to give an example of audit fees. It's directly from the audit report. So the average of the district, the comparative districts, they averaged about $49,000 each for their audit fees. Collectively, all the districts that would be part of the regional spent $104,000 on audit fees. So the difference of $55,000 would be a savings generated by unifying the districts, regionalizing all the communities. And we did that in a number of different cost centers to generate the first level of savings. The second has to do with a staffing analysis. And staffing, quite frankly, is the largest component of the savings, with districts being a very labor-intensive organization. Some 70 to 80% of our expenses are in salary and benefits. So you would expect that that would be a large component of the savings, and indeed it is. So what we do is we took a look at administrative positions almost exclusively and identified what would be needed. We built a framework for the regional and saw what redundant positions there were and used those as savings. That staffing analysis is the second component. And to sort of frame and see whether those numbers made sense, we used the third methodology, was looking at the research and academic literature to determine whether what we've seen from the physical analysis makes sense. And there are a number of studies that focus on New Jersey and regionalization, and we took a close look at those. Some identified when smaller districts combine and regionalize, there could be savings from efficiencies as high as $2.6 million for each district that is regionalized and consolidated. So in this case, we'd be close to, with the number of districts being combined, $8 million in savings. We identified about $2.4 million dollars in savings of grouping all the communities together to form the all-purpose regional. So what's the difference? In some cases, the difference is the shared services. The districts involved currently do just a wonderful job in sharing a lot of services already. Those savings are already included in the status quo component. So there are no additional savings that we're identifying from shared services. Another is in the area of efficiencies. So there are two types of efficiencies. One that lead to savings to the bottom line and generate tax savings. The other are savings in efficiencies that don't generate direct savings but improve the performance and overall functionality of the school district. So what would one of those savings look like? And I gave this analysis, this example earlier. It might be the New Jersey Smart reporting for student and staff information. Every district has somebody who does that. Right now, there are 5 or more people who are reporting that data to the State Department. And with a regional, that might be 1 or 2 people. So the other individuals that do that reporting, it's part of a larger position that they have. Those positions would not go away. That function or task would go away. But that person then could take that time and spend it doing other things that are going to add value to the organization. Those are still economic efficiencies. They just don't translate to tax levy reductions. So that's important to keep in mind. The other is to take a look at what these savings look like in the context of the overall expenditures for the new school district. And when we take a look at that, we see that it represents $2.4 million, which is a significant amount of money, but in context of expenditures, it's 2.7%. So very reasonable amount of expected savings and reductions, and I think aligns well with some of the research. So in the different scenarios, there are different savings because some districts are not participating in the regional. And under those scenarios, if there's one district that's not participating, the savings drops down to $2.1 million. If 2 districts do not participate, then that savings drops to $1.8 million. So with that in mind, let's take a look at some of the other scenarios and see how that lays out. So this is the all-purpose regional without Eagleswood, using the 100% equalized valuation allocation method. And I'm going to go through 100% equalized value for all the scenarios. That would be the recommended allocation method for all these scenarios. I'm not going to go through the 50-50 split or the 100% enrollment at this time. So in terms of this scenario, under the 100% equalized valuation, we see that Eagleswood has an increase in taxes of $219,000. The increase is due to tuitions and transportation currently borne by the regional, and now Eagleswood would need to pay tuition to the new regional that would exist under this scenario. And those increasing costs are associated with that increase in tax levy. So I mentioned earlier the savings for the regional were $2.4 million. In this case, 2.1. In estimating the tuitions, we said in the assumptions that these were certified state tuitions. In estimating them, I reduced the value of those tuition rates by the savings that would be generated from the regional. So we've already discounted the tuition rate in that regard. For the other districts, they all see tax decreases in this scenario. Little Egg Harbor at 1.3 million, Tuckerton at 252,000, and Bass River at 242,000. Let's take a look at another scenario without Tuckerton participating in the all-purpose regional. Here we see that Tuckerton now experiences a tax increase of just over $1 million. Same rationale as Eagleswood in the last scenario. Eagleswood sees a $1.2 million decrease in taxes. Little Egg Harbor, a decrease of $968,000, and Bass River, a decrease of $620,000. So the final scenario is where both Eagleswood and Tuckerton do not participate in the all-purpose regional. And here we see that both Eagleswood and Tuckerton are experiencing the same level of tax increase as they did on the individual scenarios, which is to be expected, and Little Egg Harbor and Bass River split the savings between them. So to sum up, all the constituent communities in all four communities for the all-purpose regional see tax reductions under the 100% equalized valuation allocation. Under the alternative scenarios, the districts that are not participating see an increase in tax levy, and the constituent communities see a tax reduction using the 100% equalized valuation allocation. There are some other global recommendations or conclusions, and Kerry will go through those.
Thanks, Steve. So just to provide some wrap-up and overview, and then we'll open it up for questions. The recommendation from the experts who prepared the feasibility study is that the communities consider moving forward with an all-purpose PK-12 regional school district, which includes all four of your communities. As Steve just described for everybody, the four-community all-purpose PK-12 regional school district results in the most savings overall, so $2.4 million in annual savings. And the tax savings for each of the communities is a relatively equal spread, meaning all of the communities will see some tax savings if you move to that regional school district structure, and it's funded with a 100% equalized property value structure. So the recommendation is that the boards consider moving to that, which would be a referendum that would be presented to all of your communities, and all of your residents would be able to vote on that. The educational analysis, as Dave Hesby mentioned, is that while your communities are doing a fabulous job educating your students, there are some limitations, and a PK-12 regional school district removes some of those barriers. Some of the barriers that no matter how much shared services your boards of education do, which they do a commendable amount, as you've heard tonight, there are just some things they can't do. Right? They can't move teachers from one district to the other to maximize that educational experience for your students, so there are just some things they can't do. So the educational services are expected to increase, the educational output expected to increase with a PK-12 regional school district. And finally, from a demographic standpoint, it's important to know that all of your students will fit in those buildings that you currently have. So the recommendation is that there not need to be any renovations to any of your buildings. The reason that we did that, by the way, it's not something that we as a team decided that the students should not move. But the purpose of the study really is to give you an apples to apples comparison. So this study looks at what you're doing now, what educational programs are in your buildings now, what your student to teacher ratios are now, and what it would be if you were to move to a PK-12 regional or one of the other options that are studied. So keeping your kids where they are would be an educational decision that your Board of Education can make. Obviously, you'd have the flexibility as a larger community to move students around in the future if that's the decision that your future Board of Education would make. But for purposes of giving you really an apples-to-apples comparison, we assume all of the educational programming that you have in place now stays that way. So any changes that can come about, if you want to use that savings for something else other than tax relief, that's up to you as a community. And then you can make some of these changes. Any changes that your boards may be considering or your communities may want. Do you want to say anything? Okay. I'm going to turn it over to Vito for a wrap-up, and then we'll go to questions.
All right, so there's an extraordinary amount of material and backup data. All of you will get copies of this, the reports, charts, appendices, et cetera. And as I say, I suspect that there'll be a great deal of discussion in the communities as you decide which of these recommendations, if any, you want to assess and submit to your voters. The one thing that we're saying with great confidence is that they're, without making changes, as Kerry said, we're not assuming you're going to change student-teacher ratios. We're leaving teachers and students where they are. That there's over $2 million in annual savings available to you. It can be submitted to the voters in such a way that every community gets to experience those savings. And it is unanimous among the experts that it's worthy of consideration and worthy of consideration not only by your boards, but by your voters. So with that as the first process tonight, and I can't tell who the board presidents are, board secretaries, how you want to run this. Nick, I guess I'll leave that to you. Happy to submit the group to any questions, perhaps the boards of education first, but why don't you let us know how you want us to proceed, and we'll field the questions.
Why don't we just have members of the public and the board who would like to ask questions just come down to these two microphones. I would just ask that you state your name before, so we can record that before the minutes.
My name's Justin Way. I do see by what you put up that you have show a drastic cost saving. But with the regionalization, what happens to the taxes when the contracts have to merge with the pay scale of like Little Egg, where Tuckerton's paid less and such, as well as the contracts? They'll all be merged in, so they're all going for contract negotiations at the same time because it's regionalized?
So the teaching staffs are going to be merged, but the collective bargaining agreements are not. So you'd actually be negotiating a new collective bargaining agreement. And the last time anything like this happened in the state was South Hunterdon Regional. Kerry actually did those negotiations, so I'm going to defer to her. But it does not mean that teacher salaries all have to be justified, because I think the premise of your question, appropriately enough, is what would happen to our savings if all of the teachers had to go on the Little Egg or Pinelands Regional Guide, and that's not how it will work.
Then it's not, you're trying to make it fair for the taxpayers, for everybody's got to pay the same rate, but now you don't want the teachers to get the same rate. You're having teachers do the same job.
No, sir. We're not telling the boards of education what the contract should look like. We're just saying they're not automatically merged where all the teachers from all the districts are bounced up to the higher salary. That's not how it works. You can't reduce the salary of tenured teaching staff members.
Oh, I
but
understand that.
You have to negotiate a new agreement.
Okay, and historically, over anybody else who's done this, what have they done with the salary guides?
So I can answer that. The last time that we did this for South Hunterdon Regional up in Hunterdon County, what happens is the recommendation here is that the current districts are dissolved and a new district is created, right? So with the creation of a brand new district, your contracts go away, but you have to create a new contract. So in South Hunterdon, what we did is we sat down with the new bargaining unit, which was a wall-to-wall bargaining unit, created all the former school districts, all of their members became members of a new bargaining unit. That new bargaining unit sat down with the Board of Education and went through negotiations the same way that you do every probably 3 years. And a new contract was put together. Members of that bargaining unit came from each of those school districts. So in that case, it was West Amwell, Lambertville, and South Amwell. There were members from all of those schools on that committee, and they decided what was important to them, what they wanted to have in the final contract. And the salary guide at the end of the day was submitted to the union with the overall negotiated increase. So as you all sit down for new negotiations every 3 or so years, you come up with what that dollar figure is, right? So it's 3%, 2.5%, whatever that is. What we did in South Hunterdon was that 2.5 or 3% number was added to the total dollar figure. And so we had a total dollar figure to pay the teachers, and the union decided what the salary guide would look like. And all of the teachers in that unit were placed on that salary guide. So it wasn't the sort of unfair result where some are left with one salary guide and a different salary guide. Everyone ended up on the same salary guide at the end of the day.
Okay, did it put them up to the higher salary? Because you can't take away from the person with the higher salary. They would have had to brought everybody up to that.
No. So they don't get, so some of the teachers for the first 2 years while we were going through negotiations had their salaries held at the rate that they were at the prior district until they could place them on the guide, and then they received the raises commensurate with whatever was negotiated. So it's not an automatic increase, and it's not a decrease. Some may stay sort of frozen for a year or a year and a half while you negotiate, but that's not any different than what happens when you go through negotiations generally, if it takes a while to get through negotiations.
Crickets. All crickets.
Is that microphone on?
Tap on that, see. There you go.
All right, so Steve Halford, Eagles Report. Few things. So the slides you did are all highlights of the report, right? The report is fully detailed and documented. All the charts, graphs, calculations, formulas, everything that's all included. Great, my big numbers. Now.
Very thick, 160 pages.
I'm going to read it all. The demographics. I'll try and go through each of the categories if you don't mind real quick. The demographics portion. Was anything taken into account of recent demographic studies and releases that were done by the state showing Southern Ocean County being a huge boom over the next 10 years as far as population concerns?
So the information that we used from the county strictly was for the individual towns, because usually they're the best indicators of what's going to happen in the future. So I'm not sure if you're talking about population projections by the county, so no.
So it's historical data, nothing going forward?
There is some projected data. So there's a group called the Delaware Valley Regional Planning Commission and the North Jersey Transportation Planning Authority. Both of those were used to project the future populations in the communities. However, they were based on 2010 census data, which of course is now very old. And none of these agencies will start to put anything out for another, I would say, usually about 22 or 23. So this is based on data from 13. The one DVRPC is from 2013. The other one's from 2017.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
And then, by the way, you guys answered a lot of the questions I had as I was typing. Actually, you did in the summary. Thank you very much. So some of these are going bye-bye. I don't remember the gentleman's name on the TV.
Dave Hester.
Dave Hester, thank you. So he made a statement that says, but basically, my question is, the regionalization improves the quality of the education. Do you have anything in the report that quantifies that statement that we can read through?
Dave, I'm not sure if you could hear, but the question is, when you say that the regionalization improves the quality of education, what in the study did you use to quantify what you describe as improvements? What measurements did you use?
Or are they in the report that we can review?
Right. So what I looked at was the opportunity to improve through the assessment data and the school performance data. So if you look at the assessment data from 1819, of course, there were state assessments in spring of 19 or the spring of 20, and compare each one of the districts to the state average, you'll see that rarely do the districts exceed that state average. There are 8 subjects and grades, and for the most part, we're seeing exceeding the state average 3, maybe 2, maybe 1 time. And so that was the starting point. That certainly there are improvements that could be made. And then the second issue is, well, how do you make those types of improvements? And the research will indicate that bringing expertise and capacity into a curriculum office to make certain that your curriculum is aligned to the curriculum standards that are then tested, that you have professional development that is focused not only on the gaps, but making certain that all students in your school, especially those struggling academically, especially special education students, are capable of achieving those standards. And so that's the connections that I try to make in the study to support that conclusion that I do think education can be improved across the districts.
I have more questions, but I'm not going to, related to that, but I won't bring them up tonight then. Over to the financial side of the fence. All your finance numbers assume that Little Egg approves the regionalization as well, or was Little Egg pulled out as one of the, as one sample as well?
No, none of the scenarios had Little Egg as a separate district. They were included in all the scenarios.
As the base.
As the regional, in the regional.
Yeah, no, I understand that, but there's a possibility, you know, we all have to talk to taxpayers, we have to convince taxpayers one way or the other, et cetera, et cetera. But if Little Egg taxpayers don't approve the regionalization, what does that do to the rest of us?
So it's actually, the first part of your statement is actually a good one. We did not come up with the scenarios that were studied, so we didn't presume that a Little Egg would absolutely want to move forward with a regionalization. So the committee of members from each of the boards who sat together, one of the first meetings that we had, we went over what they wanted to see studied. And it was not, so Eagleswood and
that was
Tuckerton.
never taken into
It was
account.
never, no, they didn't ask, and there were representatives from
I know.
Tuckerton and there were representatives
I
from
know.
Eagleswood, and both of them said, well, we just want to see what it would be like if we opted out, right? So if Eagleswood opted out, if Tuckerton opted out, and then one of the things that was additionally added in there was, well, what if both Eagleswood and Tuckerton wanted to opt out? But there was never a discussion or a request for us to study if Bass River or Little Egg Harbor did not want to be part of a regional.
Yeah,
But that still is a decision that their board and the taxpayers need to make.
Yeah, I mean, opting out is different than voting out, basically, my point. So if they don't approve it, then the regional, then basically all the models, the financial models, would have to go out the window pretty much, right? There are no other scenarios that were created other than those 3, basically, right?
That's fair to say.
Okay. That takes care of one of the other questions then. The school properties that exist. So Eagleswood Township owns the Eagleswood School building, Tuckerton owns their school, Little Egg owns their schools, et cetera. Do all the properties roll under the new district, or do they stay the property of the township? And then what travels with the debt of those properties? Does it stay with the township, or does it go with the new district?
Yeah, very straightforward question. If a new district were formed, the new district would be responsible for the assets and liabilities inherited from the old district or districts. So you'll see in the report an analysis which is required by the Department of Education of what debt, for example, if it was all accumulated,
Correct.
what would that look like? And that could be prohibitive. It is not in this case at all. But just as you might imagine, if you just took 2 districts and made it simpler and brought them together, all the assets and all the liabilities would be the province of the new district. So if you think about Pinelands Regional right now, where you have an entity to which the taxpayers in a number of communities contributed, but none of those taxpayers or towns own the regional's properties owned by the region. This would be the same, except it would be K through 12 instead of a limited purpose, owned by the new district.
Yeah, Pinelands I'm less worried about because Pinelands, the debt is spread across all the taxpayers equally. But Eagleswood, if we have debt, are others going to pay that? Little Egg, same thing, vice versa. It crosses towns essentially. At that
You're
point,
absolutely right, and that has to be taken into consideration
Right.
and was.
So, I think that was it. That answered a couple of questions. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
study that we're reviewing tonight will be available on the Pinelands and Little Egg Harbor Board of Education websites. I'm sure Tucker and Eagle will make it available, but it will be available on the website by tomorrow.
Hi, good evening. My name is Isabella Farrow. I have a few questions. We've heard a lot, pretty much from everybody on the panel, how the schools will remain functioning as is, which is fantastic. As a taxpayer, as a parent, I would want my child to stay in the school district. I'm having a hard time, though, wrapping my head around the figures of the Eagleswood, and I'm going to go with Eagleswood because that's my district, savings. If we're talking $1.2 to $1.5 million in tax savings, and the school is going to function as is, how are we pulling those numbers? Redundancies in our school don't quite cut it, because in a school we still need a principal, we still need a school nurse, we still need all the staff members. The only thing we don't need is our fantastic business administrator, unfortunately. We don't need an attorney. That would be a regionalized auditing. There's key things that we can merge, but I don't see how that is projecting a figure of $1.2 to $1.5 million. In the detailed study, are we going to see itemized cuts that Eagleswood taxpayers will have to be willing to forego to save this money?
Well, the savings are not based upon cuts. The additional savings you're talking about is a function of the formula. So we're not presuming what you described and then another $1 million in cuts. But let me have the numbers guy explain that, because you don't want a lawyer to explain the finances, I'm sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, you brought up a similar question, and I contacted your business administrator the next day and did an analysis that I think would help clarify it. So I'll explain, and then maybe he could share that with you.
It was shared. I just think that as taxpayers, everybody has the right to know, not just the BA and the Board of Education. I think everybody has the right to know, so my question is, what we are going to lose as a district to gain this incentive, is that going to be outlined in the feasibility study?
Okay, so I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding of savings as opposed to tax reductions. When I was going through the different tables, I tried to, and sometimes I interchange them, but I tried to be conscious of using tax reduction rather than savings. So the savings reduce the entire amount that the regional school system will need to raise from all taxpayers. Then it gets allocated and on a equalized valuation basis. So the allocation drives how much Eagleswood will raise in taxes, not the savings. And let me give you an example. If there were no savings whatsoever, and each district contributed what they currently contribute in tax levy to their own district and the regional, and there were no savings at all, and we took the overall amount, I think it's $44 million, and we now allocated it by equalized valuation, Tuckerton would see a $900,000 reduction in taxes. No savings, no changes, no reductions whatsoever. You still see a $900,000 reduction. Well, how is that? It's because you are 9% of all the district's tax levy. But when we do it by equalized valuation, you are 7% of the equalized valuation of all the districts. Therefore, you're paying essentially 2% less than you would have if you looked at just allocating it by tax levy. That's how you're getting the tax reduction. Your share of that $2.4 million savings is also 7%. So that's why you're seeing a $900,000+ tax reduction, and then a little on top of that to bring it up to 1.2 million. That's the 300,000 comes from your piece of the overall savings for the district.
So
it's
based
not, I'm
on
sorry,
that,
but it's not taking reductions directly from your district,
Right,
meaning
it's the
you're not coming up with
overall.
$1.2 million of a district that maybe has a $1.5 million tax levy. That's not how it works.
so based on that equalization figure that we are going to have a tax decrease on, would also be our equalization figure on what the new regionalization tax budget levy increase would be. So right now, Eagleswood, we're regionalized for middle school and high school. We have a smaller percentage of what gets taken out of our taxes every time the Pinelands Board of Education ups their budget 2.2% on the tax levy. So with that being said, our equalization in the stake in that aspect would increase.
Well, we did a 5 and 10-year projection using a regression analysis to determine what each community's equalized property values would be, projected out 10 years. And then we averaged 5 years in order to get an annual impact. And that shows the $1.2 million annually over the 5-year average. So we are taking a projection. So I'm not quite sure if that's a projection for the entire new regional. In addition to that, we projected to get the status quo, we projected the existing formula that's used to calculate the Pineland Regional 7 through 12 tax levy for each community. So we used projected enrollments, projected equalized valuation in order to get the tax rates going into the future for both the individual Eaglewood district and Eaglewood component of the Pinelands Regional School District.
So that is
if that
based
makes sense.
on a perfect storm, though, because you did mention that these were key assumptions and that new board decisions may impact the budget. So ultimately, just like me as a Board of Education, our budget impacts I can't say what my budget is going to be next year, and my decision next year might be greatly different than what I plan my decision today to be. So everything tonight is based on a perfect storm. You give us an idea and hope that a new Board of Education will follow it. That doesn't mean that the new Board of Education necessarily has to follow it, correct?
Well, I think the way you said it, respectfully, I would probably say it backwards, right? We're not making assumptions about what boards will be doing. We're relying on boards doing what they have been doing. So the example that Steve used, which I think is a good one, is the student-teacher ratio. We're not assuming you're making any change to it. You could have more kids in a classroom and less teachers if you wanted, and then you'd have less staff expense. You could change that and have less students in a class and hire more teachers. We're not making any assumptions about what a board would do. The assumptions are that the boards will do what they have been doing. And you're correct, you can decide to do something different. But the savings are coming, you have 5 separate school districts, you're going down to 1. There are a whole host of ways to save money, but the only changes in staffing that are baked into these numbers are changes in staffing that we know you'll have to make. You're not going to have 5 superintendents, 5 business administrators, 5 auditors. Those are the things we know. But the other things, the way you operate your school district day to day and year to year, our assumption is not that you're going to make certain decisions. It's that you're going to continue to do what you have been doing. Because in our considerable experience in doing this, that is the best predictor of what you're going to do, which is what you've been doing.
Understandable. Thank you. I just actually have 2 more quick questions. During the feasibility study, was our shared contracts taken into consideration? And I'm going to use the example of busing. Obviously, we all have a shared contract of busing. Our contracts have been set in stone since the beginning of time. We pay an astronomically cheap rate for busing compared to what we would have to go out and contract today. And I'm sure busing is just one of the many shared services that we have that we are going to have to renew contracts. In my life, I've never seen a contract go down. I've always seen contracts go up. Has that been taken into consideration in the study?
It has. I did take a look at your contracts. I took a look at the district efficiencies. I have to say, you're right on target. The efficiencies in the various districts on transportation are excellent. And the study does comment on those. There are no savings identified from any transportation routes.
Okay.
If there's any transportation-related savings, it has to do with perhaps multiple transportation coordinators. So in a district this size, you would have a transportation coordinator and an assistant which would be, I believe, sufficient to run the transportation operation, but no reductions were included in terms of routes. I think they're highly efficient, and they're going to the same schools. We kept them the same.
Okay, and then my final question is, and it's more of just a clarification on this, send receive districts, if any of the district decided not to regionalize, from my understanding, when this occurs and we have a send receive district, the state and the state only gives the figure of what it costs to educate one child going to the receiving district. At that point, again, I'm going to go with Eagleswood because that's my district. If Eagleswood decided not to regionalize and we decided to go into a send receive district, any district in our area we would be able to send receive with. The state gives us a figure, and I'm just going to throw this out of the air, $22,000. The districts cannot charge us 1 penny more. The taxpayers' regionalization tax goes away. It becomes a full Eagleswood tax. The Eagleswood would cut a check per student to the receiving district, and when the receiving district does their yearly budgets, that 2.2% tax levy or whatever the board decides to initiate on the taxpayer never impacts Eagleswood. Is that not correct?
I think everything you said was correct until the never impacts Eagleswood.
Well, the regionalization tax wouldn't impact Eagleswood. So if the regionalization Board of Education, Eagleswood's Board of Education would impact it, but the regionalizing school district wouldn't impact.
I'll describe how it works because you used the phrase regionalization tax, and I'm not sure.
Well, because right now Eagleswood has our Eagleswood elementary school tax and our regionalization
Okay,
tax.
so if your question is, would there be only one?
So it would just be the Board of Eagleswood's Boards of Education only that would
Correct.
impact the taxpayer.
And part of the Eagleswood K-6 tax levy would be the cost of educating those 7 through
Correct.
12 students, writing a check as you described. Your description of the statutory obligation is correct. I would say that the state doesn't dictate what is charged or what has to be charged. The state dictates the maximum that can be charged.
Right, but the receiving district can't charge a penny more than what the state is saying.
Cannot charge more than that.
Correct.
Could charge less if you negotiated
Correct.
that.
Right.
And you pay that number
And that
times the
number.
number of kids.
Correct.
That's math a lawyer could do, so I'm comfortable with this
Right.
one. And then there's a true-up process 2 years later. So you pay that.
Right.
And then the following year, the district financials are presented and you have an audit. And then a year later, it could be, for example, you sent less kids than you thought you were going to send. So maybe you're owed money. On the other hand, maybe you sent only a few kids less, and that district's enrollment went down, and so you have the same fixed cost divided by a less number of kids. The per pupil number went up, and so you might owe money. And that's sort of a
Right,
seesaw
but when
that
you're
goes
dealing
back
with a
and forth.
school that has an average of no more than 22 kids per class, it's very easy to assume what your give and take is going to be.
I agree, and those assumptions are what you do to budget, but there is a true-up process 2 years later, and I just wanted to mention that.
Absolutely,
For the sake of
100%.
completeness.
Okay, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Hi, good evening. Can you hear me okay? I'm going to keep this on. So my name is Colleen Neal. I represent, I work at the New Jersey Education Association, so we'll get to know each other well. I represent 5 of the 6 unions that will be affected by a possible consolidation. That would be the 2 unions at Little Egg, the one at Pinelands, the one at Eagleswood, and the one at Tuckerton. I do not represent Best River. I have a number of questions for you. For the record, none of the unions have taken any position whatsoever considering their consolidation. We're in a fact-finding mission. We're looking forward to reviewing your documents and learning more and working with the community and the parents. So a couple questions. Number 1. What is the district's timeline for the decision-making process regarding going forward or not going forward? So I don't know, maybe the district can answer
Yeah,
that.
there's no deadline, so I think that's a question best directed to each of the boards of education.
Would they like to answer that tonight?
Since they're just getting the report, I don't know that any of them would be prepared to answer your question, but if they are, I guess they can shout out when they expect to consider things.
All right, so that's one that we'll like to look at. What will Porzio's role be throughout this process? If the boards decide to go forward, what will your part? Is it just the feasibility study, or do you stay along with the process?
If they want us to provide legal advice, we'll do so, and that has been a role we've typically played in other cases where we've done this sort of
Right, it
work.
sounds like with South Hunterdon, you were involved with South Hunterdon?
We were.
Yes, yeah, they asked us to stay on to help them through the process, to get it to the voters, and then the new Board of Education, then they asked us to help with the new collective bargaining agreement,
Right.
negotiating that. So yes, they asked us to stay along.
Can you give me a sense of, from feasibility study presentation to implementation of regionalization in South Hunterdon, the timeline? And not that I'm asking you to say that's what's going to happen here, but just for some kind of way to look at it, relatively speaking. Can you give us some information on that?
Yeah, my recollection is that it was approximately a year before anything was submitted to the voters, and then approximately a year after that, the voters approved it, and approximately a year after that before it was put into place. So let's say from a night like this until there was a brand-new school district, approximately 2 years.
Okay, great, thank you. I wanted to just make a comment about the first man who spoke tonight. We will definitely be talking, if we go forward, about collective bargaining and salary guides and terms and condition of employment. But I do just want to point out that there is a bill sitting on the governor's desk as we speak, and that's S3488. And that does speak to some procedural items having to do with salary guides and terms and conditions. And there is a section in that, and I'm not saying that's the one the governor is going to necessarily sign, because I know some people are trying to make amendments to that before he signs it. But that actually says in there that after 3 years after implementation, the association with the largest numbers of teachers, that will be the contract that goes into full effect, or until a successor agreement is negotiated, like you did in South Hunterdon. So this bill changes the procedure a little bit, so that might answer your question. But it would be good for you to Google that and just kind of check it out. We're hoping that the governor signs it soon. It'll kind of clarify some things as we go forward.
Yeah, we're aware of that legislation, and as I say, neither in the reduction of the number of teachers nor in any reduction of teachers' salaries did we take any of that into account in doing this study. So there's no financial analysis that would be impacted by that, because we did not assume less staff or less costs for staff in projecting those savings.
Right, yeah, I saw that in your thing. And I just think it's important for people to know there is a procedure. We're not reinventing the wheel. And then if this passes, the procedure's pretty clear and laid out. So you can have a lot of staff members in all of these potentially merging districts that are going to be very concerned, how does this work? And that's how it works, it's spelled out. So, and that's my job, you know, I'll help them with that as well. Okay.
Thank you, yes.
Yep. Another question. Oh, is this presentation going to be available to view on the websites of the district? I know Nick said the documents. Is this that we're doing right now, is that going to be a presentation that's taped? Okay, awesome. Okay, let's get into some money stuff. How will the consolidation affect the district regarding state funding in regard to S2? We know that Little Lake especially is getting hit with the new formulation for state funding with S2. Did you look into whether the consolidation would benefit or harm as far as, or maybe slow down the hit from S2?
So we did take a look at state aid. The basic assumption is that the state aid would be the same as it was in 2019-20. S2 would impact the districts whether they regionalized or didn't. So what we looked at is what state aids would be impacted by regionalizing. Because if a district's losing adjustment aid, they're going to lose adjustment aid whether they're regionalized or not. With the exception of the legislation that you just pointed out, has a longer phase-out period for adjustment aid and make certain guarantees about state aid that the individual districts had, and then as a collective with the regionalization, what that regionalized district would maintain. So there's advantages in that regard with the new legislation for regionalization. But there were two aids that were really impacted by regionalization. The first is choice aid. So choice aid, I think the district, mostly Tuckerton, has a very large choice program, and it's about $480,000. So we took a look at the students and where their home districts were, because if there are a lot of students from outside the communities that form the regional, then there's a possibility, if the regional became a choice district, of maintaining that aid. Unfortunately, there were very few choice students that didn't come from the communities that are involved in the study. So practically all the choice aid would be lost. On the flip side, there's SEMI, it's Special Education Medicaid Initiative. Those funds, most small districts do not participate in that program because either they don't have enough kids, it's a very heavy administrative burden, so many waive out. Little Lake Harbor, from my analysis, is excellent at getting reimbursement. Their reimbursement per pupil is extremely high, higher than many other comparable districts. And so we took a look at that, and now if you took the special education students in the other districts and you applied the same reimbursement rate that Little Lake Harbor can get, and one of the advantages of regionalization is now that expertise now spreads to all the communities. It showed about a $168,000 increase in special education semi-funds. So net of the two, we took a look at that impact, that potential impact as part of the study, and everyone still maintains, with 100% equalized valuation, a tax reduction. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, it did. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Capacity question. I know in the last board meeting at Little Egg, there was some discussion that the pre-K situation there was so big that they might have to bring in some trailers and things. So when you were talking about capacity and being able to handle all the enrollment, was that in consideration? And are we saying pre-K growing when you're looking at your demographic stuff? Is pre-K growing, and do you think the buildings are going to be able to sustain that?
I'd have to go back and look and see what I have for the pre-kindergarten projections, but the capacity is based upon each district's long-range facility plan. So the way it's calculated is one of two ways. It's either the district practices method, which is how many students, what would we like in a classroom for every single teacher. Multiply that by the number of classrooms, here's my capacity. Certainly not a fixed number, because if we decide that we want to educate more children in a classroom, that capacity can go up. The other methodology is called the FES method, which is based on a square footage allowance per student. So depending upon which methodology was used in the report, and should I say, if the LRFP, the long-range facility plan, is older, those capacity values which I'm using, which are all provided by the individual school districts, could be out of date in terms of how they are currently being used.
Okay, thank you. Okay, a couple more questions, actually, a few more questions. So I was reviewing your document. You have a piece on long-range uncompleted projects. I was just curious about this. There's nothing listed for Pinelands in Little Egg or Bass River. I know Bass River, that makes sense. Does that mean there are no long-range projects for Pinelands or Little Egg?
Well, it's part of I took that from the long-range facility plan, and some districts don't detail the expected projects in the long-range facility plan.
Page 136, sorry.
So if I wasn't provided that information, then I just put NA there. Okay. But every district has some long-range plans that they have for the district. Maybe it wasn't detailed in the
So that can maybe be
facility plan.
updated?
Yeah.
Okay. On page 138, it was really interesting reading about the transportation, by the way. It was really helpful. I'm curious, what's the expectation for Tuckerton? My understanding is Tuckerton does not use bus services, yet the table on 139 says there's 3 routes for Tuckerton. So my question is, will they be using bus services in the future? Will they be sent to a different school building, and where are they going? So basically, what's the expectation if Tuckerton were to join in as far as busing their students, their children?
So the 3 routes could be special education routes for students, out-of-district placements, K through 6. So I'd have to look at what those are in order to tell you specifically. But Pinelands does the transportation for 7 through 12. So what the expectation would be to Tuckerton is I'll qualify this by saying, assuming that the new board has, similar courtesy busing and different policies along those lines, the same as they exist now, then Tuckerton would continue to do what they're doing now. If the district doesn't provide transportation because everyone is within the 2-mile distance to the school, then it would continue that way, unless the new board decided they were going to reduce the courtesy bus or increase courtesy busing and change
And it
that.
just kind of, so my other question to that was, I believe you said it was, the region is about 148 square miles. So I guess it would depend if they were going to consolidate, if potentially, maybe buildings are used for grades, right? So could potentially all 3rd graders from Eagleswood, Tuckerton, Little Egg go to Eagleswood School Building? What is the furthest distance? I don't know if you looked at this. What's the furthest distance a bus ride could be, and what is that in time? Like, let's say if we moved a kid from Tuckerton to a building in Eagleswood.
Well, the working assumption in the study is that all the children are going to be educated where they're educated right now, and that would not be disturbed for 5 years following any consolidation. So we didn't engage in that sort of hypothesis.
So buildings stay the same for 5 years?
That's
Your assumption.
That's the recommendation, and as I said, we weren't going to assume that boards were going to make those different decisions. But if they elect to make them, our recommendation is they not have them take effect for 5 years.
Okay, thank you, that's helpful. On page 142, there's some information about administration, and basically the procedure, once approved, the newly established regional would form a Board of Education and hire a superintendent. And it goes into some more there. So I have 3 questions there. One is, who makes up this? It says this transition team will be created, right? So this transition team that is created for it looks like 6 months, is that made of the existing team of administrators, a new team? Who chooses? A lot of questions here. When are the positions posted? And can you talk about the procedure for creating the new regionalized Board of Ed?
Sure. So under the existing law, the executive county superintendent would select the members of the Board of Education. The breakdown would be the same as you see on the Pinelands Regional Board right now. Our expectation and our experience is that those members would be selected from the existing boards of education. There's nothing in the statute that requires that, but we've never been involved in a circumstance where the county superintendent rejects what the local boards of education want to do. And that new board would make the hiring decisions.
So when we talk about the administrative transitional team, that would be posted by the new board. The board gets formed first, then they post these jobs, and then they come up with the transitional administrative team. Is that correct?
Well, how they elect to fill the positions would be up to them, but what we did in South Hunterdon, and what we hope we would do here, is convince the county superintendent to name the members of that board months in advance of the new district taking effect, so that the act of advertising / posting for those positions, naming those folks, and then getting support staff around them could all be in place prior to the July 1 of year X when the new district begins. So you won't find what we described in the code. You'll simply find the authority of the county superintendent. But our experience is that they're very happy to let the local boards of education take the lead on that.
Okay, that's helpful, thank you. I didn't know if that was an elected thing or appointed. Okay, thank you. On 146, you have some things about oh, I'm sorry, that's busing stuff. I already asked you that. A question, and you can use South Hunterdon if you want, but I'm just curious, what is the average percent of job loss, A, at the administrative level, and B, at the staff level, certified versus educational support staff? So I'm just curious, in your experience, what does that loss look like in a percent?
I can't tell if you're interested in a dichotomy of loss between voluntary loss and involuntary loss.
Right, well, right, you're going to have people retire, right? So that's going to
correct.
happen, right?
You will.
So, you'll have that. In your experience, if you take those that retired out of the mix, because that's going to happen, of those that have not retired, what is I just want an average, like an idea in my head of potential job loss at the administrative level, certificated staff level, and ESP level.
So
You're talking just about the creation of this new regional district?
Correct.
yeah, I'll invite Carrie to fill in the gaps, but I think you have to make a distinction, if I may, between the formation of districts where grades and grade levels are being moved to different buildings and a situation like this where that's not occurring. In a situation like this where that's not occurring, our experience is that outside of the central office, you wouldn't see any greater job loss than you normally would because there's nothing disruptive about it. In the other cases in which we've been involved where there's a great deal of movement from building to building, and in some cases district to district, right? There you see a marked increase in retirements. I can't quantify it for you. I don't know that Kerry can, but I can tell you that they are vastly different experiences. So our expectation here is outside of the central office, you wouldn't expect the staff to look different from year 1 to year 2 any more than you see now.
Okay, thank you, that's helpful, and I can talk to my colleagues that have been through both, scenarios, so that's helpful, thank you.
I agree with Vito. I encourage you to speak to the folks up in South Hunterdon because while we did expect some pushback from the NJEA, they didn't get any. And that's because the boards of education made a concerted decision to make no changes that weren't directly related to the need for the regionalization, which, as Vito said, really was just central office. And they basically held harmless. They said, we're not closing out any schools, we're not going to move people around, we're going to keep everything where it is for at least 5 years. And I don't know that we got one grievance. It was a very smooth transition and supported by the...
Yeah, and it's not to say that we won't be very supportive here. We don't know yet. We'll look at the impact on education, and we'll look at the impact, potential impact on our members. And if it's good, then we're good. And if there's a problem, then there'll be a problem. Okay.
That sounds good.
Page 149 talks about debt schedules. And I know, our people look into this in more depth. But can you talk about the extending bond issuances? If you can explain the potential burden for Little Egg and Pinelands bond issuances on Eagleswood and Tuckerton. I say that because I see here Eagleswood is $3.7 million. Little Egg is $12 million. Pinelands is $313,000, and Tuckerton is under $40,000. So clearly, looking at Little Egg's $12 million, how does that affect, if you can speak to that, how does that affect the others?
So when we do the overall calculation for the status quo and the regional tax levy, it includes the debt service as part of that. So the impact is what the tables that I presented tonight would be. So it's not like we're treating the tax levy separately from, for all the different districts based on what that community had incurred before the regionalization. Once, and I think Mr. Gagliardi pointed this out, once they regionalize, the regional has the tax burden and the asset. So they have the liability and the asset, and they will levy those taxes based on the formula and the obligation for that particular year as part of the budget process, the way that's done now individually throughout all the districts.
Okay, thank you. A couple more, I promise. What was the approximate savings in South Hunterdon when they consolidated? I think you said all here would be 2.4 million annual savings. Do you recall what the savings was in South Hunterdon?
I want to say it was somewhere between 250 and 500,000. It was not that much.
Less than this.
Oh, it was, but the project,
I think it was a little more than that. It wasn't as much.
it's yeah,
It wasn't as much as this?
mm-mm.
Okay. Thank you. No, that's good. This is a Board of Ed question, so anybody Board of Ed in the house, you could just kind of maybe just.
Can I
take a-
just go back to that last question
Yeah.
for a second? No, it's just in terms of the scope, because I think the only thing looked at in that study was superintendents and business administrators. I don't think it went into as much depth as we conducted in this study.
I do know that they were doing even more, I mean, they were struggling, so they were doing even more shared services than you're doing here. And just as the case here, where the shared services are so robust, the savings would be higher if you weren't sharing the services. So in that particular case, they were running almost a unified administrative structure for the 4 districts anyway, so there wasn't an opportunity for as much savings.
Okay. Just for the boards to think about, the question is, are you planning on transitioning to the same teacher evaluation model? Most of these districts are using the Danielson model, and I know Pinelands uses Marzano, so it's just something to think about. All right, on page 156, I just had a question. You have a scattergram here on teachers. You have 344. I pulled my numbers today. I have 376. I just wondered what date you used for that. Is this a couple years old?
Yeah, that was 1920.
19-20, right, Steve? It wasn't that old.
School year 2019 to 2020, yeah. Okay.
Sorry.
Can you provide a combined scattergram of administrative staffing for all 5 districts involved? And this might be the last question. How can we get copies of all the documents that you have been given to do the study? So all the districts gave you documents through which you did your study. Can we have access to those?
Sure, well, for the sections you're talking about, we were using existing collective bargaining agreements. But I don't know that there was any document that we used that is not a public document.
Okay.
And the documents on which we relied and the assumptions made are spelled out specifically in the report.
So we'll pull busing contracts and all of that, but anything that we can't get our hands on, we'd be able to speak to you and get those if we need them?
As I said, I don't know that we used anything that's not a public document, but
Okay.
what we relied on is laid out in the report, so I don't think there's going to be any mystery about it. In fact,
Okay.
I'm certain there isn't.
Great, okay, thank you for your time, appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Hi, Jennifer Zappia from Eagleswood. I have one very quick question before I get to my list here. How did she get a copy of the report and we didn't?
I have no idea how that happened.
Okay.
We-
Because, I mean, just to be very transparent, we all know that this is the only meeting that you were going to provide to us without charging the district $6,000 per meeting thereafter. So I would like to come up here with educated questions. She was able to do that page by page. I am not, and I'm wondering why nobody else is able to. That tells me there's something incredibly shady here that you don't want us to see.
I can't share that conclusion, so I don't know who got copies of the report when. So anyway, you said you have a list of questions. I'm happy to entertain.
I absolutely do. So the whole point of this entire study was to save all of our district's money. Why are you charging $6,000 for us to be able to come up and ask you additional questions for any meeting thereafter?
Yeah, we're not charging you to ask additional questions. But
But
we're,
you're
let's be
charging
clear,
for
let's be
meetings.
clear, we are charging for the services we were asked to provide in a request for proposal. So any and all districts could have planned for any and all meetings they wanted us to attend as part of this request for proposal. So we were asked to perform certain services, we were contracted to perform those services, we performed them.
For additional funds?
No, we're performing the services we were asked to perform.
Right, so this, what we're doing now was in the RFP. We're doing exactly what we were asked to do.
If the districts decide to regionalize, Eagleswood currently has 5 seats on our own Board of Education. That will be reduced to 1, correct?
Right, just like Pinelands Regional is now, the same breakdown for all the communities.
Right, so the voice that we have with a collective 5 people on our Board of Education will then be moved. We will go to 1 person on the Pinelands Regional, where you guys have literally said that we would have the choice as we decide to regionalize, and within 5 years, the decision will go to the board to be able to decide what's going to happen to our buildings, what's going to happen to our children's and our administrators. If Eagleswood is only down to 1 voice, how do we express that voice into what we want for our children?
So I don't know who serves on the Pinelands Regional Board of Education right now, but as far as your 7th through 12th grade population, you have 1 out of 9 voices. The breakdown that we're describing is not a recommendation from us. It's simply what your population dictates according to the statute. So the same representative way you serve the interests of your 7 through 12 population, you'd be serving through the K through 12 population if you elect to do this. Obviously, you can choose not to, but if you do, your assumption is correct. You would have 1 out of 9 representatives on that K through 12 board.
Right, so my child, who's now 4.5 years old, if we regionalize, nothing will happen to the building that my child is in Eagleswood Elementary for at least the next 5 years, or any administrators or any staff that's provided in that building.
That's our recommendation. That's not a decision anyone who's elected to make it has made. That's our recommendation.
Right, because then we'll go down to 1 voice on 1 board who will get to make that decision for all of Eagleswood.
Is that
I'm
a
asking you,
question?
is that correct? Yes.
That my answer is still the same, 1 out of 9. So each of the 3 times you asked it, my answer is the same, 1 out of 9. But that's not our recommendation. That's state statute.
Are there hard copies of that report available for us this evening?
Are there hard copies of the report available?
Perfect, thank you.
Good evening. I just have a quick question. I'm Debbie Januzzi. I'm president of the Little Egg Harbor Board of Ed. Thank you for the presentation. I'm kind of concerned about the Board of Education's role in this moving forward, and where would we get guidance to make sure that everything is done in sequence and done properly? Is it New Jersey Board Association? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, as Kerry pointed out, that's a service we have performed for other districts.
Okay.
This is a process we know very well. So we'd certainly be happy to work with your board. The process, may be modified by a change in the law that we described, but we're very familiar with that. So I'm sure we can help you. I mean, there's really 2 things you want to worry about, right? So the first is making sure, as you point out, the process is fair to the citizens, to the staff, to the students. And then the second, ultimately, is the fact that the public is going to make the decision about whatever it is you think best serves your community. So in our experience, making sure that everyone, not just on the board, but everyone in the community, understands what's at stake here. And as I was just saying to the representative from Eagleswood, they may decide to sort of take a different path. But we certainly would want to make sure that everybody understood what the facts were and what's at stake here, and we'd be happy to help you do it.
And what could we do as a Board of Education for the community? Because there are people that came out tonight. Of course, not everyone came out. And I'm sure that once this gets out into the community, that this meeting took place, there's going to be so many questions and misconstrued ideas of, moving forward. So how do we, as a Board of Education or as the Boards of Education, get this information out? It's hard for us even to understand sequentially how things are going to occur. How do we do that?
So several of the things that we've been asked to assist in the positions, like with South Hunterdon that you heard
Right.
about. So they asked us to help them prepare FAQs that could go out to the community, executive summaries,
Right.
additional information to send out to the community. So really, if there's something that you think your community would find useful, if you want additional questions answered, we can continue to work with you to provide that information to make sure that your community gets answered all of the questions that they have.
And I have one other question. All the budgets, I'm assuming, are going to be combined. How does that actually, what does that look like? They're all combined and...
It's one budget. So it's probably built the way many budgets are. In this case, I think it would be truly zero-based budgeting because you need to establish from the very ground up what it is you need for that program or that service. You go, building by building, administrator by administrator, function by function, and you build a budget that includes the entire organization. So you have history in each individual district of what's been spent, and you could get a good idea of utilities and what those costs
So
would
brand
be.
new, starting.
And so, although it's a new organization, it's rooted in historical data, and it will be the function of the business office to gather that information, and the superintendent to coordinate with the various, I call them budget managers, people who have input into the budget, and really establish each function from the ground up. And one of the things that we included in the report are some opportunities and challenges of regionalization. And I think you hit on one of the major opportunities. It's a fresh start. It's an opportunity to say, the things we've done in the past don't have to be done that way in the future. And how do we want to see this organization handle whatever the thing is? How do we want to handle the instruction or class size or whatever, and create an opportunity of really creating something new, refreshing, and exciting with all the research and experience behind it, and really starting from scratch to make something that's going to work for the communities, and really can get input from various players. If it's done right, can really be a thrust to move education forward in the community. And I even doing the report, I know I'm on the finance side, but just it's so exciting an opportunity to see all the potential that could go into this type of reorganization. So I think you bring up an excellent point. It's something that I think is worth everyone considering.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And thank you, Mr. Hespy.
Good evening. I'm Sue D'Ambrosio. I'm with the Eagleswood Board of Education. First of all, thanks for coming out today and giving everybody a good rundown. But we've got a lot more homework to do before we can, even come up with the slightest idea of what we want to do. A lot of due diligence is needed, and I'm hoping you can help me with that. Can you give us one or two more examples of some districts that you did work on with regard to regionalization? Successful ones, and ones that you told them, no, it's not going to be a fit for you. You keep talking about the South Hunterdon, but you also said in the beginning that there were a lot of districts that you've worked with regard to regionalization. The only one I've heard is South Hunterdon. So if you could give us a few more examples of that, that would be very helpful.
Sure. The reliance on South Hunterdon was germane twofold. Number one, it's the most recent, and second of all, it's the most comparable in terms of creating a K-12 district where there were three districts, constituent districts, and then one limited purpose 7-12 district like you have here. So geographically speaking, there was a district known as Lower Camden County Regional, which was a 7 through 12 school district serving the children of Berlin Township, Clementon, Chiselhurst, Lindenwold, Pine Hill, Waterford, and Winslow Township. We were retained as special counsel to Berlin Township, Clementon, Lindenwold, Pine Hill, and Winslow Township. And that regional school district was dissolved, and we assisted Berlin Township in going from a K-6 to a K-8, Clementon going from a K-6 to a K-8, Pine Hill going from a K-6 to a K-12, Lindenwold going from a K-6 to a K-12, and Winslow Township, which was a K-6, the largest K-6 in the state, going from a K-6 to a K-12. So we did all of that work. There were 700 and some odd staff members who were affected by that, and there you had people moving to different buildings, and we had only one grievance that we handled because we worked very closely with the collective bargaining units there in terms of tenure rights, seniority rights, that sort of thing, to sort of minimize the chance for any litigation there. An example of a study that we did that recommended not going forward would have been North Hanover Township in Burlington County. They had an assumption that there would be some significant savings there, but because of a large amount of federal land there and aid associated with it, our initial recommendation advised them to cease the project because they were not going to see a savings. They would have seen an increase even if they reduced the number of school districts. There are other projects that we're working on that are not completed in Bergen County. We did a project that we ultimately recommended they not go forward any further in Warren County. We handled the first dissolution of any limited purpose regional school district in state history in Union County. We are working on a project currently in Camden County and another project for all of Salem County. And we're working on, we have done work on and are currently working on projects in Ocean County, and we've done at least one, maybe two in Cape May County.
Now, with South Hunterdon, did you come in the very beginning, similar to the way you did here, and did the study, and then after the study was completed and they went to referendum, they said, you know, Porzio Group, we want to hire you to keep going?
That's correct.
Okay. Doesn't that seem a bit of a conflict, that you would be able to say, we want you to go forward with regionalization, and then you get the contract afterwards as well?
Does it seem like a conflict that
Yeah,
they had such confidence in us after working with us that they wanted to work with us some more? No.
Right, but how do we have the confidence in saying that, yeah, you know, your study is spot on, knowing that there's more of an end game? You see what I'm saying?
I see what you're saying, and again, I have to answer the question the way I did when it was asked previously. What we did is what we were hired to do. We were
Right.
not asked at the time we were hired, would you stick around for X hours or X period of time and provide additional work? If we are asked to do that, and obviously you heard the question from Little Egg Harbor, we've done that in the past and we'll do it again. And as long as there's no conflict of interest, it's something that we're very comfortable doing. But I don't see it as a conflict of interest if a client wants to hire us because of our expertise and we agree to be hired.
Okay, I guess that's fair. I think the optics are a little funky, you know.
I understand what you're saying. That had never been an issue before, and as I say, I don't know that it'll be an issue here. No one is under an obligation to hire us, but we're pretty confident in what we do, and we've done more of it than anyone in the state.
Okay, that's fair. Thank you. And just one other thing that I really think to everybody out here goes without saying. You know, when you look at these school districts, these are some top-notch school districts with top-notch administrators, the best teachers anywhere. And these kids are learning and thriving and flourishing. And whatever way this turns out, it's not going to be a loss for these kids if they stay in the school districts that they're in.
Well, I think you heard the former Commissioner of Education say that the school districts are performing very well as they are right now. So I don't think it's without saying, and I think you'll be justifiably proud about what is said about the districts in this report.
Right. I just want to make sure that that point is very well taken and very well known, because some of the slides started to, I don't know, it made me feel a little, that we were kind of being put down because of being smaller districts.
No,
So,
again, I think you'll feel proud and should feel proud after you read the report. But you had someone who's been Commissioner of Education twice tell you the districts are performing very well. And I've not heard, obviously my colleagues can chime in, that any of this was driven by a concern about the performance of the districts. It is harder, the smaller you are, particularly the way state aid is being doled out, to continue to maintain the programs that you have. And by
and
design,
yet they do. And
Yes,
yet
correct.
every one of these districts does.
That's correct.
Right. If I could just add something, Vito?
Thank you, Dave. Go ahead.
Yeah, so, I don't want to lose that point. Each one of the districts has things to be proud of. Eagleswood especially has a lot to be proud of. We have a science program that is just tremendous, but that doesn't mean there aren't areas where you could do better. I was in a job twice where every day I woke up and people with great pains pointed out my deficiencies. And, my goal every day, I said to them was, listen, I'm not perfect. I want to improve every day. And that's, I think, the motto here is that you're doing great things. You should be very proud. But are there still areas where you can improve? And the answer to that is yes. And I think regionalization could help you in that area. But don't take that to mean there's not great things happening in your districts, because there are.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Can I add one thing? Just want to make sure that you understand, too, that we, the three of us, the man on the TV and the gentleman on my right, we're all independently hired to write this report. I work for a company called Statistical Forecasting. So we're not going to create a study that is going to just say, yeah, let's regionalize, because Porzio, we work in conjunction with them, giving them our work. But we're not going to create a conclusion at the beginning and work our numbers to get to that conclusion. That's not the way I work. And I know that's not the way these two gentlemen work to my side. Just want to let you know it's a very objective study.
I'm glad to hear that.
Sure.
Thank you.
I just want to say that I really appreciate you guys coming out, and I really appreciate you doing the quantitative and qualitative analysis. But the problem is with everybody here and in the community is that since you guys didn't give us anything to even read to come here, it's so hard, A, to understand what you guys are talking about, because if I started talking to you about my job, you wouldn't have a clue what we were talking about. So it doesn't give us the leverage to even understand, let alone ask questions that can answer all of the variables that we're going to have to make huge decisions in the future for. So I really think that was a mistake for us as a community to not understand what we even are here for in the first place before we even get here. You did your homework before you came here and gave us this whole speech. We have nothing, and we're trying to grasp at all of these variables. It's very, very, very difficult. So I just wanted to say that it's really hard to understand all this stuff, and that I think it was a mistake. So, oh, and my name's Corey Martinez Tortorella. Sorry. Thank you.
So members of the public are aware the board and the board's committee received a copy of the feasibility study last night. I sent it to the board committee last
want to say it's 20-plus people on the committee. I can give you an exact number, but the committee is less than a quorum of each individual Board of Education, so that when the committee meets, we're not required to advertise it as a public meeting. So I believe there's 20-ish people on it. It also includes some administrators from each of the schools as well. No problem. All right, so that concludes the study and the public comment portion for this evening. The next motion on the agenda is to adjourn. So